In part one, we saw how Anne Hamilton-Byrne used yoga and high society charm to convince Australia's elite that she was the female reincarnation of Jesus Christ. She built a following of doctors, lawyers, and nurses who were willing to give her everything: their money, their loyalty, and their secrets. But Anne's great white brotherhood was missing one thing: the heirs to her kingdom. To get them, she didn't just recruit, she orchestrated. Between 1968 and 1975, nearly 30 children were funneled into a remote property at Lake Eildon. Some were donated by members, others were illegally adopted through forged hospital records, and none of them knew their real names. Welcome back to Echoes and Oddities. I'm Ivy Monroe, and if you haven't seen part one to this story, check out the Family Cult playlist. Now let's get right into this insane story. By the time Anne Hamilton-Byrne had gathered the children around her, the image was almost complete. A beautiful spiritual leader, a devoted circle of followers, a hidden world tucked away from ordinary life, and a group of children who all carried the same name: Hamilton-Byrne. From the outside, if someone only saw a photograph, they might have thought the children looked unusual, but not necessarily abused. They looked neat, orderly, almost old-fashioned. Many had the same pale blonde hair. Many wore matching outfits. They stood together like a carefully arranged family portrait. But photographs can lie. Or maybe more accurately, photographs can hide what is happening just outside the frame. Because behind the image Anne created was a childhood built on control. The children were not simply being raised, they were being shaped, watched, corrected, punished, and trained to accept Anne's version of reality as the only truth. Much of their childhood was centered around Kai Lama, the isolated property near Lake Eildon. The children called it Up Top. And even that name feels fitting, because it was not just physically separated from the outside world, it was psychologically separated too. It was up there, away from ordinary families, away from schoolyards, away from neighbors, away from relatives who might ask questions, away from people who might see too much. To a visitor, the area around Lake Eildon could seem peaceful. Quiet water, mountain air, trees, open sky. The kind of place someone might describe as a retreat. But for the children of the family, that isolation was not freedom. It was a cage with a beautiful view. They were homeschooled. Their contact with the outside world was limited. Their days were controlled by adults loyal to Anne, and those adults were often called aunties and uncles. But these were not ordinary aunties and uncles who came over with birthday gifts and family stories. These were followers, people who believed Anne was divine, people who believed her instructions carried spiritual meaning, people who helped enforce the world she had built. And for the children, that meant there was almost nowhere safe to turn. If they were afraid, who could they tell? If they were confused, who would explain the truth? If they were hurt, who would protect them? The adults around them were not outside witnesses. They were part of the system. That is one of the most disturbing things about growing up inside a high-control group. The child does not know they are inside something abnormal. They do not have another version of life to compare it to. They do not wake up one morning and say, "This is a cult." They wake up and say, "This is home. This is breakfast. These are the rules. This is what happens when I disobey. This is what love looks like. This is what family means." And inside Anne's world, family meant obedience. It meant silence. It meant sameness. It meant knowing that Anne was above everyone else. The children were told Anne was their mother, not a symbolic mother, not just a spiritual mother, their mother. And that lie was one of the deepest forms of control. Because when a child believes the person controlling them is their parent, the abuse becomes tangled with love. Fear becomes tangled with loyalty. Punishment becomes tangled with belonging. And even when something feels wrong, the child may still wonder if they are the problem. Anne's power did not always need to be loud. Sometimes control works best when it becomes normal. The children learned what was expected. They learned when to be quiet. They learned how to behave. They learned that adults were watching. They learned that Anne's approval mattered. And they learned that being different was dangerous. The matching clothes and matching hair were part of that. They were not just visual choices. They were messages. You are not your own person. You belong to this group. You carry this name. You reflect Anne. You exist inside her design. Individuality was not something to celebrate. It was something to erase. And for children, that kind of erasure cuts deep. Because childhood is supposed to be when you discover who you are, what you like, what makes you laugh, what makes you different, what makes you feel safe. But inside the family, the children were not encouraged to become themselves. They were expected to become part of Anne's perfect image. And when they failed to fit that image, the consequences could be brutal. Survivors have described harsh punishments, beatings, food deprivation, emotional cruelty, humiliation, and a constant sense that love could be taken away at any moment. Food became one of the tools of control. Some survivors describe being kept on strict or inadequate diets. And when food is controlled, especially for children, it does more than make the body hungry. It makes the mind desperate. It teaches a child that even basic needs can be used as punishment, that comfort is conditional, that survival depends on obedience. And then there were the medications. The children were reportedly given psychiatric drugs, not because they had chosen treatment, not because they understood what was happening, but because the adults around Anne had the access, the authority, and the willingness to use medication as another form of control. Imagine being a child and not fully understanding why your body feels different, why your mind feels foggy, why you feel tired, strange, frightened, or disconnected. And imagine the adults around you acting as if this is normal, as if this is just part of life, as if the problem is not what they are doing to you, but you. That is what makes this story so hard to sit with. Because these children were not only lied to about who they were were also made to question their own feelings, their own instincts, their own sense of reality. And all of it happened under the language of spirituality. The adults around Anne were not saying, "We are harming children." They were saying things like discipline, purification, preparation, spiritual growth. They believed, or at least claimed to believe, that Anne knew best, that she had a divine plan, that ordinary people outside the group could not understand. And that is how cruelty gets protected. Not always by secrecy alone, but by meaning. When abuse is wrapped in spiritual language, people can convince themselves they are doing something holy. When control is wrapped in the language of family, people can pretend it is love. And when a leader is treated like God, ordinary conscience becomes dangerously quiet. Anne was not at Kailama every single moment, but her presence was everywhere. Even when she was not physically there, the children lived under her authority, her rules, her image, her expectations, her punishments, her myth. She was the mother, the teacher, the divine figure, the person everyone else orbited around. And when a child is raised inside that kind of world, the leader can become larger than life. Not just a person, a force, a voice inside your head, a fear that follows you even when she is not in the room. Some of the children later described Anne as glamorous and terrifying at the same time. And that combination is important, because Anne's power was not built only on fear. It was also built on longing. She could appear beautiful, elegant, special, maternal. She could make people feel chosen. She could make followers feel like being close to her meant being close to God. And for children starved of normal affection, even small moments of approval could feel powerful. That is one of the cruelest patterns in controlling environments. The same person who frightens you can also become the person you desperately want comfort from. The same person who punishes you can become the person whose approval you chase. The same person who harms you can become the center of your world because they have made sure your world is small enough that there is no one else. Inside the family, the children were not just being controlled by rules. They were being controlled by confusion. Anne was mother, but not really mother. The adults were family, but not really family. The property was home, but also a place they could not freely leave. The group said they were chosen, but many of the children felt afraid, hungry, and alone. And when your whole childhood is built on contradictions like that, it becomes hard to trust your own mind. Was this love? Was this discipline? Was this normal? Was Anne good? Were they bad? Were they lucky to be chosen? Or were they trapped? Those questions would follow many of them long after they left. Because leaving a place like Kailama does not mean the damage stays behind. A child can be rescued from a property, but the memories come with them. The confusion comes with them. The fear comes with them. The question of who they really are comes with them. And that question of identity may be one of the deepest wounds in this story. Because most children grow up with some sense of where they came from, a birth story, a family name, a parent who remembers their first steps, a relative who says, "You look just like your grandmother." But for the children of the family, so much of that was taken. Their names were changed, their origins were hidden, their relationships were manufactured, and the woman they were told was their mother was actually the person standing between them and the truth. Think about how much power that gives one person. Anne did not only control where they lived, she controlled the story of their lives. She controlled the past, she controlled the present, and through her apocalyptic beliefs, she tried to control the future too. The family taught that the world outside was doomed, that ordinary society was spiritually blind, that the group had special knowledge. And for children raised inside that belief system, the outside world could seem dangerous, corrupt, or meaningless. That made isolation even stronger. Because if you believe the outside world is evil, then running away does not feel like freedom. It feels like betrayal. It feels like danger. It feels like stepping into a world you were taught to fear. So the children stayed. They obeyed. They adapted. They survived. And from the outside, the image of Anne's perfect family remained intact for far too long. But no controlled world is ever as perfect as it looks. Children grow. They notice things. They compare stories. They feel the difference between love and fear, even when they do not yet have the words for it. And over time, cracks began to form. Some of the children started to question what they were being told. Some began to resist. Some began to realize that the adults around them were hiding something. And one of the most dangerous things inside a cult is not always an outsider knocking on the door. Sometimes it is a child inside the system beginning to understand that the world they were given may be a lie. Because Anne could control their hair, she could control their clothes, she could control their names, she could control their food, their schooling, and their punishments. But she could not completely control what happened as they got older, when fear began turning into questions, and questions began turning into rebellion. And that rebellion would eventually help bring the family into the light. But before that happened, there was another layer of control inside Anne's world. A layer that was not only physical, not only emotional, but psychological, and in some cases, chemical. Because inside the family, drugs were not just something whispered about in rumors. They were part of rituals, part of obedience, part of what Anne called spiritual transformation. And some of the most disturbing accounts from survivors involve what happened when followers, and even children, were given LSD. For Anne Hamilton-Byrne, control was not enough. She wanted belief. She wanted surrender. She wanted people to experience her as divine. And to create that experience, the family entered an even darker territory, where faith, fear, performance, and hallucinogenic drugs all came together. Inside the family, Anne Hamilton-Byrne did not only want people to obey her, she wanted them to believe her, deeply, completely, to the point where questioning her felt like questioning God. And that kind of belief does not happen by accident. It has to be built. It has to be reinforced. It has to be protected from doubt. And inside the family, one of the most disturbing ways Anne reinforced her power was through rituals known as clearings. Now, from the outside, the word clearing can sound almost peaceful, like releasing pain, letting go of the past, becoming spiritually clean. And that was part of the danger, because the family used soft spiritual language for things that were anything but gentle. The clearings were presented as a kind of spiritual process, a way to strip away ego, a way to remove impurities, a way to bring someone closer to truth, closer to enlightenment, closer to Anne. But according to survivor accounts and investigators, these rituals could involve powerful drugs, fear, isolation, and carefully staged experiences designed to make Anne appear divine. And one of the drugs at the center of these stories was LSD. This was not always something people outside the group could easily prove at first. That is important, because for years, so much of what happened inside the family existed in that awful space between survivor testimony and outside evidence. The children knew what they had lived through. Former members knew what they had seen. But the group was secretive. The followers were loyal. Records were limited. And the outside world had to catch up to what survivors were saying. But over time, stories emerged about LSD being used in rituals with adult followers, and later, in some accounts, with the children themselves. And these were not described as casual drug use. They were described as controlled experiences, spiritual tests, initiations, moments where someone's mind could be broken open and then filled with Anne's version of reality. Imagine being in a dark room, already nervous, already surrounded by people who believe Anne is divine, already told that this experience has spiritual meaning. Then your senses begin to change. The walls feel different. Time feels strange. Your thoughts are louder than usual. Your fear becomes harder to separate from belief. And then, into that fragile moment, Anne appears. Not casually, not like an ordinary woman walking into a room, but staged, dramatic, almost theatrical. Some accounts describe Anne appearing in white, with smoke or mist around her, like a vision, like a holy figure, like someone not quite human. And if you were already under the influence of a hallucinogenic drug, if you had already been taught that Anne was Jesus reborn, if everyone around you treated her like God, that moment could become something your mind never forgot. Not because it was true, but because it was designed to feel true. That is one of the most chilling parts of this story. Anne seemed to understand that belief is not only about words. It is about atmosphere. It is about timing. It is about fear. It is about vulnerability. It is about putting someone into an altered state and then stepping into that moment as the answer. For adult followers, these rituals could deepen their loyalty. They could make Anne feel supernatural. They could make doubt feel like a personal failure. Because if you believed you had seen something divine, if you believed Anne had appeared to you as a holy being, then how do you go back to ordinary questioning? How do you tell yourself she is just a woman? How do you admit that maybe the miracle was a performance? And that is how control tightens. Not all at once, but layer by layer. First, Anne becomes a teacher, then a guide, then a spiritual authority, then someone chosen, then someone divine. And eventually, her followers are not just following her instructions, They are living inside a reality where Anne is the source of truth. But the most painful part is that this world did not stay with the adults. The children were pulled into it too. As the children grew older, some were reportedly subjected to initiation rituals involving LSD. And just saying that out loud feels almost impossible. Because these were not adults making informed decisions. These were children who had already been isolated. Children who had already been told Anne was their mother. Children whose names, families, schooling, food, and identities had already been controlled. And then, as teenagers, some were placed into rituals where their minds were pushed even further. Think about how terrifying that would be. A child who has already grown up in a world of strict rules and punishment. A child who has already been taught that Anne has divine authority. A child who does not have the freedom to say no in any meaningful way. Being given a powerful drug and told that what happens next is spiritual. That is not enlightenment. That is not healing. That is not family. That is control. One survivor account described being under LSD for an extended period, with Anne or others returning again and again, pushing the experience further. That detail matters because it shows how the ritual was not just about one frightening moment. It was about breaking down resistance, creating dependence, making the person feel that Anne had access to parts of the mind no one else could reach. And for children, the damage of that kind of experience can be especially deep. Because the brain is still developing, the sense of identity is still forming, the ability to separate reality from fear is still growing. And inside the family, the children were not given safety after these experiences. They were returned to the same world that had harmed them, the same leader, the same adults, the same rules, the same lies. So even if a child felt terror, even if something inside them knew this was wrong, where could that feeling go? Who could they tell? The people who should have protected them were often the people participating in the system. The adults around them did not step in and say, "This has gone too far." Many of them helped make it happen. And that raises one of the hardest questions in this entire case. How did so many adults allow this? How did educated people, people with professions, people who understood medicine, law, and psychology, become part of a system where children were controlled, punished, drugged, and lied to? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. Because cults do not usually ask people to abandon their conscience in one dramatic moment. They do it slowly. They change the meaning of things. They make obedience feel holy. They make doubt feel selfish. They make outsiders feel dangerous. They make the leader feel like the only person who truly understands. And once someone accepts that framework, they can justify almost anything. Inside the family, Anne's followers could tell themselves they were part of a higher mission. They could tell themselves these children were special souls. They could tell themselves the rules were necessary. They could tell themselves the pain had meaning. They could tell themselves Anne knew best. And with every excuse, the children became less like children in the minds of the adults around them, and more like pieces in Anne's spiritual project. That is how dangerous belief can become when it loses compassion. Anne also used control over adult relationships to keep the group unstable and dependent. Followers later described how marriages and partnerships could be rearranged. People's intimate lives were not fully their own. Anne could decide who belonged with whom, who should separate, who should be paired, who should raise a child, who should give up a child. That kind of control is deeply personal, because when a leader controls your relationships, they control your emotional world. They can reward loyalty with closeness. They can punish doubt with rejection. They can break bonds that might challenge them. And they can make sure that no relationship becomes stronger than the follower's dependence on the leader. For the children, this meant even the adults around them could shift roles according to Anne's will. The people who should have been stable sources of care were part of a system where attachments could be rearranged. Love was not secure. Belonging was not secure. Family was not secure. Everything depended on Anne. And at the center of all of this was the illusion of purification. The belief that people had to be cleansed, stripped down, made ready, prepared for the world Anne said was coming. That apocalyptic belief mattered, because if you believe the world is about to collapse, if you believe your leader is a divine figure sent to prepare the chosen, then cruelty can be reframed as urgency. Abuse can be reframed as discipline. Fear can be reframed as spiritual testing. And control can be reframed as salvation. That is why the family was so dangerous. It was not only that Anne had strange beliefs, it was that those beliefs created permission. Permission to take children, permission to erase identities, permission to isolate them, permission to punish them, permission to use drugs, permission to override normal human boundaries. And every time someone accepted one of those permissions, Anne's world became harder to escape. To outsiders, the group could still appear confusing, even unbelievable. A glamorous woman claiming to be Jesus, educated professionals following her, children with matching blonde hair, spiritual rituals involving LSD. It sounds like something from a novel or a horror film. But for the survivors, this was not fiction. This was childhood. This was family. This was the world they were forced to survive. And that is why this story should not be treated as just bizarre. Because yes, it is bizarre. It is strange. It is almost impossible to believe at times. But underneath every shocking detail were real children trying to make sense of a world that had been built to confuse them. The clearings were not just strange rituals. They were part of a larger system. A system that used secrecy, isolation, fear, spiritual language, and altered states to keep Anne at the center. And for years, that system worked. The adults stayed loyal. The children stayed trapped. The outside world remained mostly unaware, and Anne continued moving through life as if she were untouchable. But no system like that stays perfectly sealed forever, especially when children grow into teenagers, especially when those teenagers start to notice contradictions, especially when fear begins turning into anger, and especially when someone inside the system becomes brave enough to speak. By the 1980s, cracks were forming inside the family. Some followers were becoming disillusioned. Some children were getting older and harder to control. The image of Anne's perfect family was beginning to strain under the weight of what had really happened behind closed doors. And eventually, one of the children Anne had claimed as her own would help bring the outside world crashing into Kai Lama. Because Anne could stage visions, she could use drugs, she could command loyalty, she could hide behind wealth, followers, and spiritual language. But she could not stop every child from growing up, and she could not stop the truth from trying to find a way out. Anne believed her walls were impenetrable. She believed the children were too broken and too brainwashed to ever speak out. She was wrong. The secret world of the family was finally about to meet the one thing Anne couldn't control: the truth. The countdown to the raid on Kai Lama had begun.